I'm really delighted to be here today with you. I just wanted to thank, firstly, Etienne and the whole team at Hackney Archives, Lisa and Janet also, for inviting me to present my research on the Rio's feminist history from the 1980s. This research began in kind of 2015-16, and then it sort of turned into an epic 8-year journey. And in that time, one of my supervisors had 2 babies. The pandemic happened where the Rio had to close, and I had my own health issues and I needed to take some time out. But in 2023, I got my PhD at Birkbeck in the Film, Media and Cultural Studies department. And I want to thank my 2 supervisors, Dr. Janet McCabe and Dr. Sophie Hope, who supported me through the process, and Professor Laura Mulvey, who made it possible for me to do my research at Birkbeck. So the title of my PhD is, quote, Our Archives Ourselves, Remembering Through Creative Practice, the Cultural Archives of Feminist Film Programming and Curating in 1980s London. And I argued in that piece of research that there is value in documenting and keeping alive collective experiences of feminist screenings and community events because of the programming and cultural knowledge held in those encounters. And I also argued that film scholarship had failed to account for film programming and curating as a critical practice. In other words, there's value in reconstructing feminist and LGBT film history through feminist curation as a scholarly methodology. I really hope that my research has contributed to a renewed interest in rethinking the past through the collective work of feminist programming and curating at film festivals, in cinemas, and also the women who shaped the reception and circulation of feminist, cultural and alternative moving image practice. But my talk today is named after my practice that I conducted at the Rio that began in 2020, and it was called Feminist Reimaginings at the Rio, 1980 to 2020. So just a bit about me. I'm a film programmer and researcher. I've been working in cultural film exhibition for a long time, like over 20 years, at the BFI, at the Independent Cinema Office, at the Film Council, and I also was the co-programmer of the London Lesbian Gay Film Festival, as it was called then in the early 2000s. I'm a founder member of Club de Femme. It's an honour that I've been a trustee of the Rio since 2020, and I'm now an associate lecturer at Birkbeck. So this research began a little earlier than 2015-16. It actually began in 2007 when I set up this film club with my friend Sarah Wood called Club de Femme. And since then, we've been curating film screenings and events across London and elsewhere, and we also publish new writing in the project of feminist and queer film historiography. So this is our sort of manifesto, so to speak, that we wrote back then, and it sort of still stands today. And in 2012, we started working with the Rio to program feminist and queer film screenings and events. And our ongoing sort of programming work has been connected to the restaging, revisitation and recontextualization of 1970s feminist ideas and counter-cinema practices, as well as re-evaluating the radical queer and feminist work of the 1980s. What we try and do with our programming work is present fresh ways of experiencing, analysing and archiving the more ephemeral work of 1970s women's liberation and 1980s queer feminist activism. And we named our club after this French film that, from 1936. We got the spelling wrong. Sarah put an extra S on it, but we liked it because it was the plural. But this was one of the first kind of positive representations of a lesbian in, it's a French film from the 20th century. And this is just a little overview of lots of places and cinemas and spaces and museums that we've worked with since then. But our kind of spiritual home really is the Rio, and as I said, we've been working with the Rio since 2012. So the seed was planted for my PhD in 2015-16 when we were doing research to program a weekend of screenings and events at the Rio to remember the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common. For the younger members of the audience, this was a huge anti-nuclear protest by thousands of women activists at an American nuclear base called RAF Greenham in Newbury in Berkshire during the 1980s and beyond. And I grew up next door to Greenham, but I didn't really know what was going on there, so it's sort of very important sort of in terms of forming my feminist sort of consciousness. And the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common was a shining example of non-violent feminist action, and it really changed lives and laws. And it was at this time that Andrew Woodyat, who was working at the Rio and as local historian, found these cabinets in the basement that held thousands of 35mm slides, some of which were labelled Greenham Common. And some of you might know this story, but they were taken by the Rio's community photography project, the Rio's Tape Slide Newsreel group. And there was the book that came out during lockdown, which is incredible. And we started looking around the basement more and found further material, boxes and folders of flyers and posters and programs, and management reports and funding applications and other miscellanea that revealed a hidden history of feminist film programming and events at the Rio, as well as women's liberation organising, lesbian community groups and feminist networks, collectives and groups in Hackney from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we realised that this feminist programming at the Rio dated back all the way to the first women's event at the Edinburgh Film Festival in 1972, and it's connected to the curating and programming work that we do with Club de Femme. But I have to admit that it was Charles Rubinstein, who was the general manager at the Rio from 1991 to 2014, who told me in the sort of mid-noughties, he said, "Selina, there's so much feminist activity and screenings and events that were going on at the Rio in the 80s in the basement. You'd be really interested, you should look into it." And I always remembered what he said, but I was doing other things and I didn't have time to do that. But then when we found all this ephemera, I sort of re-remembered what Charles had told me. And I thought, wow, I've got to do something with this material, I've got to do some research. And so that's when I embarked on thinking about doing kind of research into Club de Femme's prehistory in London with a focus on the Rio's archive. And when we started doing screenings events at the Rio, we really had no idea that we were part of this extended history, feminist history at the Rio. And that this history dates back to the 1979-80, when local women came together to programme film screenings and events in their quest to develop audiences for women's, feminist and LGBT cinema. Presented with this feminist film archive in absentia, Club de Femme, we began the archaeological work of recuperating a history from below of women's work in programming and video screenings and events. And this, we realised that this historical programming was a form of consciousness raising in its own right, as women came together to confront the misogyny, homophobia and racism in the film industry and wider culture. So this was the flyer that we created for bringing Greenham home in January 2016 when he did this weekend of screenings and events. And the big film that we showed, some of you might know it, it's called Carry Greenham Home by Beeben Kidron and Amanda Richardson, which is a sort of a documentary about what was going on in the camp in the early 80s. And Beeben Kidron has said, women at Greenham Common taught a generation how to protest. And this is, we did some singing at the end of the screening, which was really lovely. We all stood up and sung one of the Greenham songs. And this is some of the archive that we were displaying, some new archive and some older archive. And this is some of the imagery that we found in the basement in the slide with the 35mm slides, the Hackney Women's Peace Camp outside Hackney Town Hall in 82, 83. And some of the women who had set up the camp. And then some members of the Rio Tape Slide group went to Greenham and took amazing photographs. I'm not going to show all of them, but I just showed a little bit, a snapshot of what they captured. They went several times. These are some pictures from around London. This was some of the ephemera that we found in the Rio's archive about Greenham Common. And some more ephemera. And then we realised that this film, Carry Greenham Home, had actually been shown at the Rio in the 80s, which was very exciting. And this was the sort of what the archive looked like when I first went there in 2015. And I was very excited to find this folder that said Rio Internal Documents Programming Archive from 79 to 89. So when I started kind of presenting some of my research when I was doing my PhD, I really loved showing this picture. So this is a picture of the Rio in the 80s, and on the side it says that the screening Desperately Seeking Susan, the wonderful film by Susan Seidelman with Madonna in it, was kind of a big role. But there was a quote from the film that I kind of always said that I really loved. So a piece of dialogue from the film. Cigarette girl, Susan, my God, we thought you were dead. Susan, no, Justin's New Jersey. And I really love that because it's about kind of this history that had been hidden or elided or forgotten for so many years, and it's about knowing where to look and how to look, and the questions that you're asking. And I also want to say that this isn't like a definitive history of the Rio's feminist activities in the 1980s. This is a partial history from what I've been able to reconstruct from the archive, and it's purely subjective. So I'm hoping that there's some other people here today who can help fill in some of the gaps, because there's still lots of questions that I've got, and there's still material that's that the archive is that I'm finding in the archive that I'm finding really fascinating. I also wanted to pull out this quote from the Rio's Tape Slide Archive book, which Ramsey Cameron, who was one of the programmers with Robert Ryder, which I think was really sort of captures what the programming remit was at the time at the Rio in the 80s. He says, I don't think the politics of that period can be understated as a determining factor in how we developed either the program or the cinema itself. Thatcherism, unemployment, a growing consciousness around racism, increasing cultural diversity, AIDS, gender issues, the miners' strike, etc. But in contrast to that, there was the Greater London Council that still had budgets that allowed for the support of places like the Rio and lots of others, and for genuinely progressive causes. If you look through the programmes, I think that they show that they were responding to the political climate, but also trying to be positive and inclusive. So I just going to do a little whistle-stop tour of the beginnings of kind of feminist film programming and a women's film culture at the Rio in the late 70s, early 80s. So I've sort of pinpointed 3 key people who, for me, were really important in my research. So Christine Jackson, who's a community activist who worked with Joan Littlewood at the Stratford Theatre Royal in the 70s. And in 1977, Christine and other local people created a cooperative. And in 79, they secured GLC funding to reopen the Rio as Hackney's first arts centre and community-run cinema. There was also Esther Ronay, who is a film editor activist, and she was on the Rio Management Committee, and she was a founder member of the Rio Women's Cinema Group, and was involved in kind of early women's film programming. But there was also Sheila Rowbotham, who I'm sure lots of you know, was historian of feminist and radical social movements, who co-organised the first British Women's Liberation Conference in Oxford in 1970. And during lockdown, her book came out, Daring to Hope, about her life living in Hackney and sort of women's liberation and kind of organising. And that was really, really important for me. And I've just sort of done a little bullet point of the women's networks and film infrastructures in Hackney across London in the 70s and 80s. So it was the Hackney and Islington Socialist Feminist Group that Sheila was a member of, the National Abortion Campaign that she supported, Radical Midwives Group that was associated with Centre Prize, Hackney Black Women's Group, the Hackney Women's Centre and Matrix that built it, Women in Entertainment, obviously Hackney Council, GLC, Centreprize, Four Corners in Bethnal Green, the London Filmmakers Co-op, Circles, and Cinema of Women Distributors. And this is this incredible book that that I can't tell you, if you haven't read it, you need to read it, that came out during lockdown, and it documents her life and work in Hackney during the 70s. And I sort of named my this practice, Feminist Reimaginings at the Rio, after kind of from drawing on Rowbotham's ideas and her kind of presence. And it was this twofold idea that actually took from an earlier book that she wrote, Dreams and Dilemmas, that feminism exists in our political imagination and collective consciousness, and as a method of historiography and self-archiving. And this is some of the ephemera from the Rio's archive that kind of contextualizes this work that was being done in Hackney and across London in the 70s. For example, the Women's Day March in 1975 that was in Victoria Park, and then the campaign to build the Hackney Women's Centre. And that was the Hackney Women's Centre. That was an image from the tape slide archive. And Christine Jackson, who set up one of the founders of the Rio, she was really keen on the Rio being a space for live music. So during the early days of the Rio, there were a lot of really big bands that played, especially for kind of like the women's scene and kind of the lesbian scene. So people like Meg Christensen, the Cunning Stunts was Radical Theatre, Jam Today, the Raincoats, and the Poison Girls. And this was some of this really beautiful kind of hand-drawn flyers that I found about the sort of early women's cinema at the Rio. This was 79 to 80, and it says programmed by some members of the Hackney and Islington Socialist Feminist Group and the Rio Cinema. And this is the first women's festival at the Rio in 1980, and there's no kind of names of who programmed it, but I think Esther and Christine Jackson definitely had a hand on that. Sorry, you can't quite see all the films that are being shown, but it's a really comprehensive program, like classic films like Queen Christina, but also kind of contemporary kind of women's liberation films, and also there was an amazing French film called Coup pour Coup about a women's strike in a factory in France. And they also held a women's cinema workshop at Centreprize. And I really love these questions they were asking in the workshop, because I feel that these questions are still relevant today. What is the relationship between feminist film and the women's movement? How has feminist film developed over the past 10 years? And what is a feminist audience, and what direction do you want to see feminist film take? So in my research questions, I had three key questions that I was really asking as I was in the archive. So I sort of thought, what would film history look like if we included the critical, effective, and activist histories of feminist film programming and curating? And how might these histories be mobilized through their effects, their emotions, and cultural objects like the ephemera in the archive as feminist knowledge production? And I thought past and present feminist film programming and curating practice, they contribute to the formation of cultural memory and the processes of archiving and feminist film knowledge. So I focused in the Rio's archive, I focused in on two collectives or groups who were working with the Rio at the time. So the first was the Rio Women's Cinema Group that Esther and others, Elaine Burrows is here, she was one of the sort of members of the group that was set up in 79, 80, and I think sort of lasted a few years, and it was mainly women who were associated with the Rio, who were on the management committee and friends, sort of feminist friends. And then later, the Women's Media Resource Project started working with the Rio around 1982 until I think the early 90s. So the Rio Women's Cinema Group, as I said, this was a feminist film programming group that focused on presenting and discussing women's films, past and present, and feminist filmmakers including shorts and animation, and also rediscovering early women's cinema. And in the group I've been able to find, there was Esther Ronay, there was Fiona Scott, there was Helena McIntosh, Elaine Burrows, Sandra Hooper, I think Nicola Stevenson she might have been a bit later because she came in a bit later at the Rio, and then Carolyn and Ruby, I think. It's, as you can see, it's reconstructing a very partial history. And this is some of the flyers and ephemera that I found, which I really love. Bred and Born was a wonderful film that was made at Four Corners, the radical feminist collective space in Bethnal Green, about mothers and daughters in Tower Hamlets, and that was screened by the Rio Women's Cinema a few times, actually in collaboration with Four Corners. And this is some of the promotional work, which I really love. The Rio also hosted premieres of films. So on the right, you can see a film by a French filmmaker called Jacqueline Audrey Olivier that was distributed by Circles, which was a feminist film distributor that premiered at the Rio. And you can also see the other events that was going on, the history that was going on at the time. Obviously, this film, Who Killed Colin Roach, by Isaac Julian, was screening at the Rio at the same time. Doris Day was a big, they were big fans of Doris Day, the group, so Calamity Jane was screened a lot. Just kind of Hollywood cinema, just rereading Hollywood cinema from a feminist perspective. So things like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and the classic wonderful film The Girl Can't Help It. And the other group that I researched was a group called the Women's Media Resource Project, who also set up the sound kitchen in the basement at the Rio. So they basically got funding in the sort of the last days of the GLC. They got funding through the Women's Committee at the GLC to set up a women's resource. And they actually were at the German hospital before, and then they basically moved to the Rio to do video screenings and events, but also they had a sound component as well. And this was the press release that they put out in, I think it was 83, 84. So they were a group of video and sound artists, cultural producers, music engineers, and community activists with a strong interest in challenging dominant media, with links to other alternative media making projects at the Rio, like the Rio's Tape Slide newsreel group. They also built and ran the Sound Kitchen, the UK's first women-only 16-track recording studio in the basement of the Rio that's still, I mean, the room is still there today, the padding is still there, the desk is still there. And it really was a pioneering feminist project to teach girls and women sound recording, engineering and production so they could get jobs in the industry. It was originally called Weft after a song at Greenham Common. The founder members, Catherine Maynell, Zoe Redmond, Marion Urch and Claire Hodgson, all went to Greenham. And I think at that time when it was so impactful for them, the experience of being there, they decided to set up this group. And then after receiving funding from the GLC, they renamed to the Women's Media Resource Project. And the group included Vicky Grutt, Siobhan Cleary, Maggie Thacker, Kathy Lane, Vivacious, Anne Robinson, Pia Wilkie, Mary Fahy, Vanessa Segau, Miriam Ludbrook, Pat Thomas, Zuni Looney, Ruth Novacek, Linda Flint, and more women that I'm still coming across. The group also had very strong links with the London Irish Women's Centre in Stoke Newington. So there were lots of screenings and events about the situation in Northern Ireland. This is some of the flyers that I found in the archive that I thought were interesting to share. in the 1980s, the group presented, a huge diversity of films, but some ones that I picked out were this flyer from December. Actually, I'm sorry, I didn't put the date down, but obviously you can see, I don't know if you know this film, there's Gurinder Chadha basically. It's her first film that she made, a short film called I'm British But, which is one of my favourite films. She made it in the 1980s. And I just wanted to put this in because, and also Pratibha Palmer came as well to show some of her films, because we recently found some more material in the archive that relates to Gurinder. So Gurinder made this wonderful film in '93 called Bargee on the Beach. Some of you might know it was her first film. And she came to the Rio to premiere it in 1994, and that's her on the stage at the Rio. And we found these photographs recently of the audience, and then you might recognise Diane Abbott's in the audience there. But I love these pictures of audiences because you hardly ever see audiences. You see the films, you see the promotional, but you never really see pictures of audiences and how they're responding to films. And that's a picture of the Rio's foyer. I'm sure it's like going in to see the film. And this is some other sort of ephemera I wanted to share. Club de Femmes was shown, so I was very happy about that. And also how the group, the Women's Media Resource Project, collaborated with local community groups like the Jewish Women's Media Group. So the Sound Kitchen, which was an incredible concept and idea, as I said, it was Britain's first 16-track recording studio. This was the invitation to the opening of the official opening of the Sound Kitchen, where the Mint Juleps performed. There was a women-only party. There were lots of beautiful pictures that I found in the archive of this party, but I just wanted to share. This is Viv Aitches, who's dressed up as a sailor, and Siobhan Cleary, who really were the engine room of the Sound Kitchen and the Women's Media Resource Project, along with Vicky Grutt, and that's them celebrating at the party. And this is Siobhan taking some women around the Sound Kitchen, showing them the mixing desk. Another thing that the Women's Media Resource Project did, they set up the first National Women's Video Festival in 1987, which was a huge undertaking. So many community groups, organisations were involved with it. It was really the first, and it was the only festival. It didn't actually happen another year because I think they were all so burnt out because it was so huge, and I think also there was an issue with funding. But that I feel that needs a specific piece of research done as well. I could only kind of look at the bits of it, but not like in real detail. And unfortunately, a lot of the work that was shown at the festival has been lost, or it's not been kind of digitized. So that sort of cultural memory is not there anymore. I also wanted to share that there was a lot of dedicated programming in the 80s at the Rio for lesbian audiences. In the late 80s and 88, lesbian writer, activist and educator Joan Nessel visited the Rio in collaboration with Sheba Feminist Press, which was quite a big event at the time. And this is also a flyer showing some of the other screenings and events they were doing specifically for kind of lesbian audiences. The group worked with the Lesbian Archive, which was this information centre and resource that was set up through Camden Council, that the archive is now with the Glasgow Women's Library. So they did a whole series of screenings and events with the Lesbian Archive. They also worked with Sheba Feminist Press, with this incredible feminist publisher in Hackney, for the sort of premiere of this new book that they had called Serious Pleasure, which was about lesbian erotica. And then Diane Abbott used to come a lot to the Rio at that time, and for example, she was on the panel after the screening of The Accused with Jodie Foster to talk about the issues from the film. And then just other bits that I found in the archive that I really love. I don't know anything about Dangerous When Wet. There's an Out to Swim club. I don't know who they are. I think they're wonderful. They did a screening, which I think is just gorgeous. And then obviously Hackney supported the lesbian and gay pride during that time in the 80s and continue to do. So there were screenings and events in conjunction with that, and that was something from 1989. I found actually this on, probably you know about the Radical History Hackney website, which is an incredible resource, and I use that a lot for, wow, I wonder what's going on outside. I use that as a big resource for my research, but there's this document that they posted on the website that came from the Glasgow Women's Library, which I just really wanted to share as well, because, and this is the text that the Glasgow Women's Library wrote. This events programme for Hackney Women's Centre's lesbian group is so typical of some of the social events programmed and flyers which we have in the archive. It illustrates the wide range of social activities that these groups promoted among the women that use these spaces. Flyers like this are often interesting because they can often underline the intersectional approaches to organising that feminist and lesbian spaces often try to institute around building access for wheelchair users, childcare facilities and language interpretation. And that was also something that the Rio was constantly fundraising for and trying to put into place, obviously wheelchair access, but also childcare facilities so more women could come to come to the screenings and events. Another flyer from Pink Autumn, Hackney Lesbian Gay Action in 1986, just showing again the range of activities and events that were in place at that time. Very, very vibrant, very exciting, very radical. I love this as well, the Hackney Lesbian and Gay Action. I don't know anything about the people who are involved with that group, but would really love to find out more. Astrid Prohl, who was a member of the Bader-Meinhof group, she came to live in Hackney under a new name in the 70s. She lived in some of the women's squats in London Fields, and there was Germany wanted to extradite her to arrest her for some of the campaigns that she'd undertaken. So the Rio undertook a lot of fundraising for her, and this was a screening that they did to basically to help her stay in the UK. And also I put, this is just a typical programme of the Rio in 1982, and at the top there's this film called Scrubbers, which is a film by Maya Zetling, and at the moment the BFI are doing a season of Maya Zetling films, so it's nice to see that the Rio was supporting that work in the 1980s. And I love this. This is the first gay pride film festival at the Rio. This was in 1980. Very comprehensive, really amazing kind of range of films that were shown. I then kind of did a bit of digging, and there were a lot of really amazing lesbian shorts that were imported from the States, and but in the end they never showed at the Rio because I think there was some issue with customs and paying, and so none of these films showed in the end, but which was a massive shame. But really fantastic programme. Again, it would just be wonderful to do some really sort of proper research on even this film festival and its exhibition histories. And then this piece of history, which the Rio actually, because I'm sure some of you know that David Lynch recently died. He made a film called Blue Velvet, which is a very controversial film that came out in the 80s. It was picketed by some female members of the Rio. They didn't like the content of the film, what it was saying, and the kind of violence against women represented in the film. There was a boycott. And the Rio actually last weekend just did an event called Reviewing Blue Velvet, with Mandy Merck, a feminist film scholar and writer. She was writing for Time Out and City Limits, kind of looking at that moment in kind of film history, but also kind of looking at how important it is to protest and to create dialogue and critical engagements with films. So I'm just going to run through, because I think we're sort of running out a little bit of time. Again, two kind of key films that came out at the Rio in the 80s, two feminist films. I also wanted to kind of do a shout out to some of the other groups who were orbiting around the Rio in the 80s, the women's, lesbian, dyke, feminist film groups and spaces. I'm sure I've left some off, but these are the ones that I've kind of encountered in my research, and I know there's probably more to put on that list. So Gay Switchboard, the Lesbian Line, the Cunning Stunts with this theatre group, London Fields and the Victoria Park Women's Squats, Duke of Wellington, the Women's Media Resource Project, the Sound Kitchen, some of the groups and bands that played at the Rio, the ANC Women's Section, Matrix, Hackney Women's Centre Lesbian Group, Hackney Black Women's Group, Campaign to Free Astra Prol, Lenthal Road Workshop, Centerprise, the London Irish Women's Centre, the Hackney Women's Green and Support Group, Black Audio Collective, Sheba Feminist Publishers. But I also wanted to give a shout out to what's going on today in Hackney and in relation to the Rio. So there's an amazing group of people that's led by people like Sue O'Sullivan, who was part of Women's Liberation in the 70s. She lives in Hackney. She set up this website called How, which is a history of women's liberation, where she's recording the histories and experiences of women in Hackney, London, and across the UK, their experiences of women's liberation. It's really, really inspirational. And Sue came to do an event at the Rio with me a couple of years ago and talked about that project. And even recently, on the 10th of May, the Rio hosted a fabulous screening, a late night screening of the Dirty Dykes Film Club that sold, I think there was like 300 people came. So the Rio is still a very vibrant place, a community space for all different types of groups to come to show films and to build community. Oh, now I'm really running out of time. I think what I'll do, this is a favourite film of mine, but I think I'm going to probably tell you now about my practice, what I did at the Rio. After I spent 8 years in the archive and the pandemic and everything that happened, I decided to do, in 2020, I decided to do a 4-month film season about what I'd found in the archive, rescreening films from the 70s and 80s and getting some of the women back to the Rio who were involved in programming, and some of the filmmakers and some of the organisers of this incredible kind of community work. So I put out a flyer. This image actually is from one of my favourite films. It's called Pumping Iron 2, The Women. It's made by George Butler, and it screened at the Rio in the 80s a lot. It was a big favourite. It was about a women's bodybuilding competition, but so much more. So this was an image from the film, but I had this, I put this flyer out, and I said, did you come to the women's film and video screenings at the Rio in Dalston in the 80s? Were you a member of the Rio Women's Cinema or the Women's Media Resource Project? If so, we want to hear from you. And then basically I sort of laid out what I was going to do, a 4-month series of films and events, community archiving project, and reflections of the Rio. And I really wanted it to be like an intergenerational discussion between the women who were there in the 80s, but also the front of house workers at the Rio today. They were really fascinated about a history that they didn't really know that much about, the radical work that was going on in terms of screenings and events. So my idea was to have this amazing kind of conversation and for it to kind of snowball over a couple of months. Unfortunately, I had to cancel it because of lockdown. So that was devastating because I was just like, this is part of my PhD and what am I going to do? So that was really difficult because the cinema was ordered to close, as all cinemas around the UK were ordered to close. So I couldn't, and also I just thought it's just ridiculous to ask people to come to the basement at the Rio to help me with my practice, and it was a really small space, and there's this whole issue about kind of health. There were a lot of older women, and I didn't want to put their health at risk. So I decided to kind of reformulate what I was going to do. And during lockdown, I discovered a piece of paper that I had digitized, but I'd missed looking at. And it detailed a women's mixed media event at the Rio in the 80s that included 35mm screening and 16mm screening and tapes, but also tape slide projection. And I was just like, oh, I can't believe I missed this. I was really kind of struck by this sort of tape slide projection and these tape slides that were shown. So tape slide, we know that maybe from the Rio's tape slide newsreel group, but it was really kind of associated with an expanded cinema practice in the 70s and 80s. And it was a really cheap and accessible approach to the use of image and sound. And what it comprised of a series of projected 35mm photographic slides with a synchronized audio tape soundtrack, and it sometimes was called a narrative with stills. And it was this expanded cinema technology, and the medium was taken up by a lot of women artists to formally explore the materiality of their practice and personal experiences. So I decided that I would make a tape slide, on my laptop. It wasn't the same thing, but as a sort of in reference to this ephemeral kind of moving image practice, but also, of course, the Rio's tape slide project itself. So I made an essay film using a collage of what I'd found in the archive, the fragments that I kind of found. And it was a way for me to look back, to look forward to 1980s feminist media cultures. And I hoped that the film would, and I still hope that the film provokes fresh interventions into the Rio archive and new viewpoints about community archiving and feminist cultural life in Hackney in the 80s. My research really attempts to reckon with the cinema past, to put histories of feminist counter-cinema practice to use because of the programming and cultural knowledge held in these encounters. Because when we put film programming to use as a tool of feminist activism, knowledge production and community building, people's lives change. Collective, radical, revolutionary, the cultural archives of feminist film programming and curating, and the ones that I researched at the Rio, reimagined now, can offer a blueprint for resistance and action. So I'm now going to show you my film. I should say there's a mistake in the film. I know that someone will point that out to me. So in the film, I talk about Centerprise, and I say that it's not here anymore, and I say it's now a Harvest health food shop, but obviously it's not right. So apologies for that. But I'm going to show you my film now, and thank you for listening. Was experiencing it off screen through. We want to show the work of contemporary filmmakers, including shorts and animation, as well as rediscovering early women directors such as Maya Deren, Alice Guy and Lois Weber, and occasionally comparing them to Hollywood's women's film. We will invite the filmmakers to some of the showings for discussion. This statement is taken from a Rio Women's Cinema flyer from 1984. This is where I want to start, Sarah. I wonder where you're sitting and what you're looking at when you read this account. Did you just have lunch? We did. A gives her wheelchair back tomorrow. time spent in the RIO's archive, this is a partial history of the RIO Women's Cinema Group that I've been able to reconstruct from the ephemera. RIO Women's Cinema is one of the case histories that I'm researching for my PhD. The other is a group called the Women's Media Resource Project. I will tell you about them next. RIO Women's Cinema was a feminist film programming group formed in 1983 by a group of women who worked closely at the RIO, were friends or associated with the cinema. In 1980, some of the women organised a festival of women's films. Workshops and discussions on feminism and film were held at Centerprise, a left-wing bookshop and community centre close by. Centerprise shut in 2013 and is now a health food shop called Harvest. But a cultural memory of those feminist film programming histories remain. Since the first lockdown, I've been exploring some of the paper and photographic archive which I've saved on my computer. Whilst writing this, I have a sudden memory of being at the RIO a couple of years ago, sitting upstairs in an empty whitewashed kitchen, feeling cold, looking through flyers and folders whilst listening to Hans Zimmer's score for Christopher Nolan's World War II film Dunkirk. I hadn't seen the film, but was experiencing it off-screen through sound. Me, there, inhabiting a space between the material and immaterial. The RIO, a place of other worlds, of oral and oral film histories, of visual pleasure, dreaming and remembering. Sarah, writing to you has prompted me to recently draw some new connections. For instance, in the 1980s, the RIO hosted several key women-only film screenings. Not all screenings were women-only, and there was debate among the group and audience members about creating a women-only space. For lesbian members of the group and audiences, this was important. In 1985, Donna Deek's lesbian drama Desert Hearts came to the RIO. Desert Hearts, one of the programmers told me. It was fantastic. We had it in the big screen, and Mandy and Annette got up and spoke. I remember them speaking from the balcony, and that it being a fantastic raucous atmosphere. A year later, The Colour Purple was screened. The Colour Purple, her copy writes, is it another piece of sentimental Spielberg slush, stereotyping black men and glossing over the lesbian theme in Alice Walker's story? Or is it a powerful and moving representation of black women's experience, revolutionary for its all-black cast? What would film history look like, Sarah, if that history included effective, critical, and activist histories of feminist film curating and programming? How might these histories be remembered and mobilised through their effects and cultural objects? Anne Chetkovich says this is political history as effective history, a counter-archive of feelings that intervenes in public history. Archives of moving image practice and experience that counteract the forgetfulness of history and collective memory. Let's dream that we might have gone to those screenings together, Sarah. Two friends who'd heard about them through a friend they bumped into at Gaze the Word. They'd never been to Hackney, but they thought they might go together and see what it's all about. Two friends who would almost meet at Greenham if they'd not been too young. Two friends who were hungry for feminism, music and cinema. Two friends who would meet again 3 decades later and start a feminist film club together. Can we reimagine, Sarah? I wanted to tell you about these women and their histories. Most of them are not well known. By that I mean their names are not mentioned in history books or theoretical texts. Their names have not been remembered. But by telling you, we're remembering their histories together. Citation is important, because so often the nuances of feminist collective work get smoothed over. People's names and contributions are left out, misspelt, overlooked. Also, there's an invisibility that shrouds film programming. What does a film programmer do? I remember once a former work colleague asked me jokingly, how hard can it be to book a few films? In the group, there was Esther Ronay, Sandra Hooper, Elaine Burrows, Helen McIntosh, and Fiona Scott. Last February, Fiona and a friend came to the Rio to my first feminist reimagining session, a 4-month curatorial project I'd planned to activate the Feminist Film Archive. Because of the pandemic, I decided to cancel the rest of the project. In March, the Rio was ordered to close. We were looking through some photos taken by the Tape Slide newsreel group when Fiona jumped up from her seat because she recognised herself in one of the photos. It was of an auction of film memorabilia that took place on the 5th of February 1983. The photograph was taken from height. The photographer had positioned themselves on the right side of the balcony. The cinema is packed, 402 seats filled with expectant people holding white pieces of paper. Sarah, this auction was brilliant. You could win a gold pair of autographed trousers worn by Julie Christie from her latest film Gold, or some For Your Eyes Only cufflinks worn by Topple. There was even Gandhi's walking stick used by Ben Kingsley. Exciting for us, you could win an autographed photo of Jane Fonda and copies of Scream and Cahiers du Cinema. Sitting at my desk now, I wonder who got Julie's trousers or Topple's cufflinks, and who might have come across that 1975 copy of Scream, where Laura Mulvey first published Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Julie's gold trousers, Jane's signed photo, and Laura's writing. Object materiality that sneaks into the archive. A queer feminist shape-shifting toolkit for now. Yesterday, a third vaccine was announced in the media. Apparently, they will start to immunise people by Christmas. I wonder how long it will be that we can return to the cinema again. Anxiety-free, no temperature checks, face masks or social distancing. To sit together, cheek by jowl, a community of cinema lovers, to escape, to feel, to think, to dream, to connect.